Who will the Terps' hardest game be in 2024?
You are Locked On Terps, your daily podcast on the Maryland Terps. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everyone? I'm Tre Moore, video content creator for 247 Sports and InsideMarylandSports.com, and host of Locked On Terps, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So thank you for making us part of your day. And this episode is brought to you by Nissan. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further, even wonder what a adventure could do right around the next corner? Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, and go find your next big adventure. Check them all out today at nissanusa.com. Maryland football. Who will the Terps' hardest game be next year for the Maryland Terrapins? If you guys remember, do not forget, we have an interesting new kind of schedule next year, and I'm excited for it. I was kind of annoyed with the current makeup of the Big Ten, with the two sides of the Big Ten. It was horrible. And the side that Maryland was on with Ohio State and Michigan and Penn State, and Maryland was right behind all those three, the big three in the Big Ten. It was so stupid how it's constructed. There was no chance for anybody to win that conference besides whoever came out of our side of the Big Ten. And I didn't like how it was constructed at all. I thought it was dumb. It just didn't make a lot of sense. I thought we needed to get rid of the conference divisions, and that's what happened with the expansion of Oregon and USC and Washington and UCLA all coming to the conference. We have a completely different schedule. It's all eliminated now. It's kind of like you just play. They make your schedule every year, but you can play anybody in the entire league. And so we have a different schedule. And instead of playing Penn State, Michigan, Ohio State every single year, which it seems like it's almost automatic 3 losses for the Maryland Terrapins, even though we did make some of those things interesting. And instead of the Big Ten championship basically being whoever wins the Ohio State-Michigan game for the last couple of years, the Big Ten championship will be it'll be a lot more interesting, and it might not just be who wins the Big Ten champion or who wins the Michigan-Ohio State game next year. It might be different teams. There could be more upsets with the teams coming in. It could be a lot more interesting. It'll be a lot more fair, because if Maryland was on the other side of the Big Ten, they would have a shot every single year going to the Big Ten championship, which right now seems so weird. But how it was constructed, you had bad teams going to, not bad teams, but you didn't have very good teams going to the Big Ten championship. So I'm excited for this expansion. I'm excited for Washington, Oregon, USC, all those schools to come. And we have new matchups on our schedule. And there's a couple that you could maybe argue could potentially be the Terps' hardest game in 2024. But I'm going to give my thoughts on the hardest game for Maryland, and I'm going to start with my third hardest game going into the next year is USC to me. You could argue USC maybe as the hardest game next year for us. I think it's kind of a hard argument to make, but USC is one of the potential hardest games of the season, but I'm putting it as the third hardest game of the year. We play USC at home October 19th. That's a big part of the reason why I'm saying it's one of the least hardest, is because the ones that we play in the next two that I'm going to talk about are both away opponents. But USC is at home, and I think USC is going to take a big step back. Even from last year. Last year they took a step back from even where they were. But I don't think this USC team is going to be particularly anything crazy. Maryland could be if I'm thinking about that game, I'm thinking Maryland could definitely be in that game. It could definitely be a close game. I look at the makeup of this USC team, and it's just I don't know. They lost a lot. Of course, they lost Caleb Williams, and whenever you lose a guy like Caleb Williams, it's I don't know what you're going to do after that. It's pretty much automatically going to go backwards in the quarterback room. And with Lincoln Riley, even as Lincoln Riley is your coach, who's developed so many great quarterbacks, whether it's Baker Mayfield or Jalen Hurts or Caleb Williams and has had multiple Heisman winners and Kyler Murray, like all those type of guys, which is really cool for Lincoln Riley. But even still, I don't think they're very good in the quarterback room next year. Miller Moss is interesting because he went crazy in their bowl game. He looks to be the starter for Lincoln Riley, but I don't know if Miller Moss is on the same level of that typical quarterback that we think of when we think of Lincoln Riley and Heisman winners and first overall picks like Baker and Kyler. I don't know, and probably what Caleb Williams is going to be. I don't think of Miller Moss on that type of level. They also got Jaden Maiva from UNLV, but he's expected to be the backup right now. And I don't think USC will be the hardest play because their quarterback, I don't think it's going to be an elite part of the team. And their defense is always bad. And in the Big Ten, that's not what the Big Ten teams are about. Big Ten teams are more about defense and running the football, and USC could get exposed in some spots. So I don't see them being the hardest schedule. I think their quarterback room dropped off. They have plenty of weapons, don't get me wrong. I think Zachariah Branch is a really good player, but I just don't love their defense. I know they've got a new D coordinator and stuff, but I wouldn't pick USC as our hardest game this year. If you could argue USC, if you think USC is, tell me why, but I think they lost a lot. They lost a couple of their running backs as well. They lost a lot of guys, and even they lost some guys in the skill room that decided to transfer out and were off to the NFL draft. I do think they'll always have talent in the skill positions, but I don't see them as the hardest team. The next two, you could really argue going back and forth. I'm still kind of going back and forth in my head of who is the hardest between these two teams, and I thought about switching it before this podcast. Like going into it, I was like, I don't know. Like I'm starting to convince my team that this team is more actually hard. But I'm going to stick to what I initially thought, and I'm going Penn State as the second hardest team that we play. Not the first. A lot of you guys are going to say Penn State for sure, and I think Penn State is really good. And I think they're interesting, and they're always going to have dudes now. They have guys. They seem to have a bunch of guys at the combine that are always freaks. I was watching the combine, and they were talking about that. They were like, oh, I guess they don't let you run unless they don't let you play at Penn State unless you run under a 4.4 or something like that. It was kind of funny because it seemed like all their guys are running fast times, and people were saying they had the best strength and conditioning staff in the country, which maybe you could argue because it seems like they just get freak after freak over there at Penn State. And I think they have good players coming back. They're going to have a really good run game with Singleton and Allen. But there's question marks about their team. I think their defense will also be good. But I think I have question marks. They do lose a lot of guys. They lose King, their talented quarterback, who's apparently his draft status has dropped off a lot. They lose Curtis Jacobs, their linebacker. They lose Chop Robinson. They lose some guys that they're going to have to replace, and Penn State probably is on that level where they can replace guys, but I do think that's important. They lose some players, and I haven't been in love with that receiver room ever. Their passing game last year, I thought Maryland's passing game straight up was better than Penn State's passing game. I thought Maryland did a much better job throwing the ball. I thought Maryland's receivers were better. I thought Maryland's passing game was better last year. I thought it was better designed, and Penn State got rid of their O coordinator last year. Maybe it'll be better. But that receiver room was kind of weak last year. I wasn't scared of anybody. And they add Julian Fleming. And Julian Fleming's a good player. Don't get me wrong. Coming from Ohio State, former 5-star from Pennsylvania, he's a really good player. But it's like Fleming, how good is he going to be when he's not on that he's not with that Ohio State wide receiver core where he has Marvin Harrison next to him and Emeka and Buka next to him? How good is a guy like that still going to be overall? And the question, I don't know. I don't think he's like a guy that just solves their issue. I don't think he's that type of player. I think he's solid, but I don't think he's as good as we thought he was going to be coming out of high school overall. But they do have some really good players on that defense. Abdul Carter is a freak. But going to the quarterback position, the most important position, I'm not sold on Drew Aller. I was really high on him coming in. But when I think about Maryland facing him and other teams facing him, he did play well against us, but I don't love how it looks right now. He's not very mobile, which I think really hurts the run game. I think if you have a mobile quarterback with those two backs in the backfield, I think you're on a different level. And then at times he's been really inconsistent. He's talented as it gets. Like, he's a really talented player, but I'm not sold on Drew Aller overall. So that's the reason why I put them number 2. Drew Aller is probably the number 1 reason. I know I said him last. The defense is probably going to be good, but the receiver core doesn't scare me at all, and I don't think they'll be able to get those big plays. My number 1 hardest teams that I think Maryland plays next year is Oregon. Oregon, a new opponent that we haven't played usually, which is really exciting. It's cool to be able to play Oregon. We play them at Oregon in Eugene, which is going to be weird kind of for the Terps. It's a different place. It's a really tough place to play, a really good program. And their coach, Lanning, has got a lot of things going on. He's recruiting at a really high level. But I like the quarterbacks they got in the portal. They got Tre Moore, who was a freshman last year from UCLA. But it looks like Gabriel will be the starter, Dylan Gabriel. And Dylan Gabriel is really hard for Maryland to game plan against, or any team, just because of what he can do with his legs and his arm. He's that dual threat type of ability that you don't get with Drew Aller as much. I think it makes it so hard for a Maryland team to prepare for that. I also think they got some dudes in the transfer portal when I look at it. Texas A&M transfer Evan Stewart is one of the scariest receivers in the country, one of the top players in the portal. You could argue maybe the best receiver in the Big Ten. I know there's other names on that list, Emeka and Buka and some other guys that you might want to put up there, but Evan Stewart is up there. And if Big Ten folks aren't familiar with his game, he's scary. And then they also have Tez Johnson in the receiver room, who's also really talented. And they also added Muhammad from Washington, who's a top DB as well. Oregon's talented. They got guys. I think it starts with Gabriel. I remember watching last year's game of Oklahoma. Who was it? It was Oklahoma and Texas, right? Oklahoma and Texas. I watched that rivalry game, and I was like, geez, Dylan Gabriel, he is really tough to play against. And I know he hasn't always been in the top of his game, but there is a reason Oregon wanted him, and I think he's going to be a really good player for them. I think he fits kind of what Dan Lanning wants, and I think they got a lot of guys in the portal, and they got a really strong recruiting class, and I think Oregon will be the hardest team Maryland has to play. What Maryland football players need to make a leap, and what players do I think will make a leap, a sophomore leap? I will tell you about that after this ad from FanDuel. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's any bet that you want to make for $5. If it wins, you get a bonus bet of $150. It sounds like a good deal to me. That's $150 if your bet wins. Bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. So if you want to bet over on LeBron James threes or over on LeBron James points, or if you're a DMV sports fan and you want to bet on the Wizards to win, which might not be your best bet, but you can do that on FanDuel. You can get parlays. You can get all the different things you need, player props as well, quick bets, and more. So just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. What Terps will make a sophomore leap for Maryland? We're going to need a couple players to make sophomore leaps if we want to be successful next year. So it's interesting because there wasn't a whole lot of freshmen in the 2023 class last year that were made a big impact last year. I would argue not really any made a huge impact. I'm thinking guys that started, guys that you're he's a guy. I feel like we've kind of had some of those guys over the past couple of years. I think about Jason Barham. He came in and I was like, yeah, that's a dude. He's going to be one of our better players for a while, even though he has transferred to Michigan now. It'll be interesting to see where Michigan uses him. I think Kellen Wyatt came in, played a ton, and he's not even a guy that you think of as insane, but I think he's a really good football player. But there's not been a ton of guys in this 2023 class that I've been like, yeah, like he played a ton last year and he's already set up to be one of the better players on this team. There's not a lot of that. But there is guys that I think could make a huge sophomore leap, starting with at pass rusher, Neo Avery. Neo Avery was interesting because he was hurt a lot last year. He was often listed as out on like the injury report on games and stuff. I think pretty much always. He was pretty much out for the season. He didn't play. And it's good because he got a red shirt, but I'm still going to count him as a sophomore and as a sophomore leap overall. But we didn't get to really see him play at all last year. And he came in as a really talented kid, as a 4-star. And I thought he was going to be the defensive rookie of the year, if you will, freshman of the year for Maryland. If we had to pick a guy that was going to be a guy that was the best freshman out of the bunch, I thought he had the potential to do that. But he got slowed down with the injuries, of course. But he's still really talented overall, and I'm expecting a leap from Neo Avery. It's kind of a deep, kind of edge, pass rusher, defensive line kind of unit, but I think he gets reps. I think he gets sprinkled in a lot, and I think you're going to see some of the flashes and some of the athleticism. He's long. I love his game. He's a really good player overall. I think Neo Avery, if you watch his tape from high school, he has traits that translate to college that a lot of guys like, and there was the reason he was a 4-star and a highly ranked recruit. I almost forgot when I was doing some research about him from before. He was originally committed to Ole Miss, so he had those type of offers overall. Side note, Ole Miss has a chance to be really good next year, but he was originally committed to Ole Miss before he committed to Maryland. So he's an interesting guy I think needs to make a leap because I think we're going to need him not as much next year, but we're going to need him the year after that, looking way, way ahead just in that pass rushing group. And I think he has a chance to bring in something a little bit new in that edge group that maybe a guy like Donnell Brown or Kellen Wyatt don't bring, just a different type of game, different type of player in that type of group overall. And then I'm looking at Michael Harris, the linebacker, another really talented recruit, but the linebacker room was filled last year with a ton of really good players. Jason Barham, Ruben Hippolyte was 13 mil Big Ten. Caleb Whelan's coming up and is a really good player overall. Gote's experience. Now you get rid of Jason Barham, and I'm expecting Michael Harris to get some reps. But there was a couple times I saw Michael Harris play last year, and I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. It was just a couple of spots where I saw him, and it was like, that guy has the potential to be a dude. He can be a really good player. He needed to get a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger to play linebacker in the Big Ten because you got to be big to be able to stop that run game in the Big Ten when you're going against the Michigan, even though we don't play Michigan. When we play Penn State, and they have a really good, talented running game, which they talked about. When you play some of those teams, you got to have some strength on you in that linebacker room to not get pushed around when the linemen are getting up to the second level. But he has the sideline-to-sideline athleticism where I think a year in the Maryland weight room, I guess it'll be 2 years in the weight room for Maryland, he should be ready to go, and he might not start. I expect Wheatland and Hippolyte to be the starters, but I think he's a guy that's too good not to play, and I think he could make a big sophomore leap. Ryan Manning, my next player. I like Manning. He's interesting. He's a very interesting player from St. Francis Academy, the powerhouse in Baltimore, produces a ton of really good football players overall, and Ryan Manning was just a 3-star recruit, nothing crazy, not like a 4-star like Avery or Michael Harris, but I like Ryan Manning's game, and I think he was pretty high on the coach's depth chart last year. I mean, I don't have access to the depth chart, but I think he was pretty high on that depth chart because Maryland didn't want to release it, and I think he's going to play this year. I think he gets a lot of spot minutes. We lose Jay-Sean Jones, and I think Octavian Smith and Shalik not step up, but I also think this kid, Ryan Manning, has a potential to play and is going to be able to play for the Maryland Terrapins next year. And I think he also will make a leap. I think he's a really good, solid receiver that just knows how to play the game. I'm excited to see what he can do. Spring football is going to be a big part of this and see how some of these guys can do. Then my last guy is Braden Wisolowski. He can be part of the offense. He was a kickoff return guy last year, got minutes there and was a starter there and was Big Ten Specialist of the Week one week when he returned a kick against Virginia. He's a really athletic man. I just think the reason he makes the leap is because I think we just figure out a way to get the ball in his hand, whether it's at running back, whether it's at receiver, whether you're running a quick screen to him or whether you're running an end around jet sweep type of play. You just find a way to kind of get those guys touches just because of how athletic he is and the type of player he is overall. And then my last player quickly is Dillon Wade. Dillon Wade's tight end 2, had a huge bowl game for Maryland. He has to make a leap. He might be able to make the biggest leap out of all of these guys, honestly, because I'm sure about the minutes he'll be able to get being tight end 2. I think right now he was tight end 2 in the Music City Bowl, and that was what it was going to look like right behind Preston. And he did some really good things, had a couple of catches, and shined in the Music City Bowl. So I'm excited to see what Dillon Wade can do. I think he's going to be a really good receiving back overall. The Terps performed well. Some offensive linemen from Maryland performed well in the combine. I will tell you about that after this ad from Nissan. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further? Even wonder what adventures could be around the next corner? Our friends at Nissan have a lineup of SUVs with the capabilities to take your adventures to the next level. The Nissan Rogue is perfect for city drives and great escapes. Class exclusive, built in, your always updating assistant to call on for almost anything. Gone for the day, connecting to your phone, Google Assistant, Google Maps, and Google Play Store are built right into the 12.3-inch HD touchscreen system. And then they have the Nissan Pathfinder. Has room up to 8 and expressive cargo capacity and advanced available 4x4 capabilities. With 284 horsepower and up to 6,000 pounds, when a venture calls, the Pathfinder is there to answer. Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. The Terps performed really well at the NFL Combine. Starting with Gottlieb Ayizde, had himself a day. I didn't realize how much of a freak Gottlieb Ayizde is. He's a pretty freakish guy for how big he is, how large he is as an offensive lineman. He had himself a day at the Combine and really improved his draft stock. And I think he has the potential to now pretty much solidify himself as a guy that gets drafted. There's going to be a ton of teams that watch film on this guy because guys, these are the type of guys that NFL teams are looking for. Later round guys that could be steals, especially at the offensive line. It's hard to find good players on the offensive line. It's hard to find depth along the offensive line. You often hear teams have had to switch up their units a ton and whatever about the offensive line, it's not playing well. It's hard to find good players up there. And Gottlieb Ayizde is someone who can play different places along the line, which he's done in college. He's played left tackle, he's played right tackle. He can play swing tackle, which teams are going to like. And then he also had a pretty good year last year. He was an all Big Ten type of player for Maryland, and he tested really well. He ran a 5.01 40-yard dash, which was 7th among offensive linemen. That's flying for his size. And also had one of the fastest 10-yard splits at 1.72, which was the 8th fastest. And he ranked elite in his athleticism, scored a 7.89 and measured in at 6'4", 308 pounds. So a really good performance. They like guys with that kind of potential at the offensive line, guys that can test well, guys that can move. And maybe he's not the perfect prospect, and you think of like the guy from Penn State, Fashanu, or you think about the guy from Notre Dame, that's a really good player along the offensive line. Maybe he's not perfect like that. He's not one of those guys, but he's going to be one of those guys that maybe could potentially go in the 6th, 7th, 5th round, get drafted by a team, and they're going to develop him, and he's going to be a depth player. And you make a living doing that. You can make millions of dollars being a depth player and just testing well in the combine and showing that you have the tools, maybe even potentially to be a starter one day once a team gets to work with you overall. But I'm glad that Gottlieb Ayise had a very good day. And then Delmar Glaze had a solid day as well. He ran a 5.21 40-yard dash and a 1.78 10-yard split, which is pretty good for his size. I think Glaze is in a good spot. I think Glaze was probably going to get drafted, and this combine performance probably solidified himself. It wasn't like anything crazy, but it was a very solid performance from Glaze overall. And I think now I'm looking at Delmar Glaze. I'm looking at him as about a fourth-round guy overall. Of course, he's been an all Big Ten player for Maryland football, and he's been one of our best players along the offensive line. And I'm glad we've been able to have a player like that along our offensive line, because we don't always feel like we have the best players up there, especially competing in the Big Ten with some of the top offensive line units that you'll go against ever. So it was nice that I saw Delmar Glaze have a really good day overall. And so I'm looking at our two offensive linemen. I think we could have two guys drafted overall, and I think the combine benefited both of those guys. I saw where there's a lot of NFL teams that wanted to talk to them as well, so that'll be interesting too. It's a really interesting process. When I work with the Ravens a little bit, like, they don't miss a beat. They don't miss a players. They have scouts that look at every college, basically. They have a guy from Maryland. Like, they have a guy that looks at film for everybody and all the players, basically. Like, they don't miss players. So if you're supposed to get drafted in a spot, then they will find you. And if you test well like Ayise did and Gottlieb did, then you're going to be in a good spot. And I think he is in a good spot, and I think Delmar Glaze, the film shows what he can do. That's all we have for today. Thank you for listening to Locked on Terps. Make sure you like and subscribe. We're here every day talking Maryland football and basketball, so thank you for listening to Locked on Terps.